LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffitt, and today we present part 2 of our interview with Tony Wright, in which we conclude our discussion of his forthcoming book, Return to the Brain of Eden, Restoring the Connection Between Neurochemistry and Consciousness. If you missed part 1, you can find it at LegalizeFreedom.com, that's legalize-freedom.com. Part 1 ended with an analysis of impaired brain function in the modern human race. Part 2 begins by asking how the fatally flawed left side of the brain came to dominate the higher functioning and more balanced right side, and how the result of this is playing out in the chaos and violence of the world today. Some of this reminds me of, this is probably a bit of an obscure movie reference, but in Mad Max 3, Beyond Thunderdome, there's a character in there, it's actually 2 characters, called Master Blaster, and what it is a very large, strong, but innocent man who is manipulated and controlled by a very small, very weak, but very manipulative guy who could never survive on his own. And he uses the big strong guy to get his agenda put through. So basically, I guess stemming from that thought is the basic question of why would this small, not say smaller, but why would this weaker, less optimal left hemisphere, why and how could it take control? How could it assume this position? And is you alluded to that situation changing? Is it possible that the right brain, if there's more room for right brain thinking, right brain experiences, that the balance could actually shift in our favor again? Or are we potentially on a sort of one-way track?
Well, I certainly think we have a lot of choices, but let's try and provide a bit of... I mean, I know you've read the book now, and it is a big area. It's difficult to compress all this into a short interview, and it does require some reading around and so on. But to try and address that as clearly as possible, if you imagine, let's go with this, that our neocortex was the product of this unusual symbiotic relationship and its expansion and what was effectively a proliferation of relatively unspecialized tissue with all sorts of unique traits, the kind of things we've been alluding to, and perhaps some of the traits that we like to think we have, but they've gone because there was different structure. And remember, structure relates to function. Of course, I'm not saying we are a brain, but there's clearly a connection there, and perhaps in the same way as a musical instrument influences a music. If our sense of self correlates with the music, our brain is like the musical instrument. So you change the structure, you change the chemistry, you're going to get a different result. So going back to this archaic epoch where our neocortex was expanding rapidly, and what I've proposed is that in fact each side of the brain archaically was genetically distinct, and that genetic asymmetry is still there. But with this symbiotic relationship and the influx, this flood of plant hormones or plant hormonally active compounds, changed the way our DNA was read and resulted in basically each side of the brain, certainly the new brain that was proliferating out, becoming structurally very similar, almost identical. But this all evolved in the tropical forest, so it's very design, and I mean that in the kind of DNA transcription sense, its development and its function were all dependent on and absolutely essential dependent on the tropical forest biochemistry. Okay, if that was all essential for what would be normal function, okay, then you strip that away, and one side, remember, is genetically distinct. So you start losing function in one side more quickly than the other, and you perhaps get a period of codominance and so on, which I think is alluded to in these ancient traditions. But what you eventually end up with at the wrong end of this journey is one side of the brain has reverted more to primitive type, more to its archaic type. And I say this it sounds quite harsh, but the standard or primitive neural systems, they don't have these highly specialized requirements. They don't need this phenomenal fuel mix of tropical forest biochemistry to work. Okay, it's like a thoroughbred. It's like a incredibly or a space, like the space shuttle or something. It needs highly specialized fuel to run on, highly specialized construction materials, basic engineering actually. But we've ended up with a piece of equipment that's become less and less specialized, less and less requiring these high specifications. It can run on poorer and poorer and poorer materials. And when you end up with effectively two selves in the same skull, that provides a potential means of being able to take control, because you can run on pretty much anything. You look at what we run on today, the left hemisphere, because it's relatively primitive now, it doesn't matter too much what you build it from. Doesn't matter too much what you run it from. It will run. It will be perceptually aware and run. I mean, I think it's pretty useless at everything, but it's self-aware running on garbage. The thing living next door, while I'm not suggesting it's not reverted to some degree, it still has these much higher specifications, but we're not putting those in, certainly not during early development and right through our lifetimes. So it's unable to reach full self-awareness. That's typically why we call it the subconscious mind. I think it is subconscious, and even when we're drawing on it all the time, it's not self-aware. And that's, I think, part of the reason the left hemisphere has been able to take control. It's a crude piece of equipment. It'll run on any old rubbish and run at its maximum, which is poor, but that's still, it's running at its maximum. The right hemisphere has these phenomenal requirements. It doesn't get them, so it's kind of locked in the basement. It's almost on standby mode. Yet even in standby mode, it still has phenomenal abilities. However, if you find a way to access it, or if you start putting back some of the missing biochemistry, and this is where I alluded to before, the ancient traditions and their so-called practices and religious techniques. Well, if you look at them as treatments, and you start putting in the kind of neurochemical analogues that perhaps are partially to replace this phenomenal chemical cocktail that went missing, then you start getting the right hemisphere coming to life, effectively becoming conscious. And when that happens, even for brief windows, it's beyond description, and it takes charge, and oh my God, everything's so different. So I think that's part of the reason. You basically got two pieces of equipment, one that can run on anything and it'll run at its maximum function. The other piece of equipment is a highly specialized thoroughbred. It needs specific and very complex fields to run. It doesn't have them anymore. So it's kind of a bit like the analogy you used out of that movie, Beyond Thunderdome. It's like that kind of the controlling element. Unfortunately, today will run on anything. The equipment we really want to get working has very, very specialized requirements, and it's not getting them, so it can't run. And then I think on top of that, you add in the left hemisphere again, being that it's been losing function over a very long period of time, and it's quite primitive now. Part of that is about fear. It's very frightened. Humans as a species have become very frightened. It's not something we like to admit to. It's something we try and disguise all the time. But certainly the talks I've been doing in recent years, when I ask the audience, who's free of that endless chattering voice, who would we share that with? The stuff we keep hidden from our partners, people we trust implicitly. Crazy stuff going on in our heads all the time, and a lot of it's about fear, and fear of what people think, fear of this, fear of that. Classic symptom of mental ill health. Well, if you've got a frightened piece of equipment that can run on rubbish, it's giving it a huge head start in terms of it's like giving all the weapons to the crazy guy, and you've locked somebody with function in the basement. That's kind of the dynamic we found ourselves in. However, the potential to change this around, I'd like to get to this at some point before we run out of time. The potential to reverse this is absolutely there. We make choices every day on terms of how we build our neural system, what we fuel it with, and so on. And we've been handed a massive body of knowledge in terms of how we can approach this problem. Again, if you look at these ancient traditions and the practices, you can learn a lot, I think, about the underlying condition. If you look at the treatments, they tell us something. It's like a diagnostic toolbox. Why were they doing this? Why were they doing that? Let's look at all these approaches together. Do they tell us something about the condition? Can we bring that into our kind of awareness today, and perhaps even build on that with some of the things we've learned from Western science? Can we start changing this dominance? Can we start inhibiting the detrimental effects of our left hemisphere, presuming it's not specialized, presuming it's just badly damaged? Nobody's fault. It's not even the left hemisphere's fault. But do we want the crazy piece of equipment running the show? And when you look around and what we're doing to ourselves as a species, again, going back to this idea of humanity as a single species, we're really looking at severe self-harm. That's all. It's not about wars. We're harming ourselves. We're harming the home we live in. That's a classic symptom of mental ill health. And the very fact we have traditions, if my basic proposal is correct, and it's really just a translation of ancient ideas, I find it intriguing that are these traditions universal traditions that clearly have very ancient origins, and with a singular voice they talk about some kind of degeneration. Now, their existence doesn't prove this, but it's absolutely bizarre they exist at all. Why aren't there endless traditions of our slow emergence from primitive, stupid origins in the forest, and we become cleverer and cleverer and clever? That's only come in a few traditions very recently. The ancient traditions, absolutely the opposite. And as I say, if this condition is real and its origins are perhaps 200,000 years ago, I would expect our ancestors to be more aware of the condition they had, and there'd be clues. And we have these oral traditions, and they became distilled into the modern religious traditions in various formats. Fascinating they exist, I think.
We will certainly end today with what we can do about this personally and at a macro level as well. But before we get to that, there's in the book you address a few things that are generally regarded as advancements for humanity, whether it's agriculture, but one that particularly caught my interest was writing, because writing and subsequently reading and dissemination of information that way and storing of information is regarded as like just one of the great advances, along with the invention of the wheel that humankind has made. But you point out that may not be as straightforward as that it's possible that writing developed as a way of storing and disseminating information because of impaired cognitive function.
Well, it certainly seems to fit. I'll take a couple of things there, sort of writing and reading and even speech. And I mean, the classic example I use is speech, again, often portrayed as some kind of huge crowning glory to humanity's advancement and so on, when in reality, speech, and again, it's a bit of a play on words, speech is really just a dumbed down form of singing. And yet most of us, myself included, would struggle to sing and probably feel quite inhibited about singing, quite frightened, why ever that would be, but it's real enough. I can certainly present my information in speech, and yet singing carries so much more information, so many more layers, and even in relatively recent times, there seems to be historical accounts that humans would convey information in various forms of poetry and plain song and singing with so much more information, and yet singing is clearly more to do with the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere generally cannot sing. So what's going on there? Why would we trade a much more advanced form of communication for a much poorer form of communication? I mean, that's just something, again, another question to throw into this mix. Of course, individually, any of these questions could have answers. I'd like them all laid out and say, well, do they all fit together? And then back to your point on reading and writing. Well, again, all the information we have so far suggests that we have potentially phenomenal memory. I mean, currently we have these general ideas of working memory and then eidetic memory. Working memory generally is our day-to-day memory. It's kind of the left brain's explanation for its own memory. Basically, it's incredibly poor. So, but it's seen as some kind of specialized adaptation, and it's because we get overloaded with information and we don't want to remember it all. It's a pretty convenient explanation for something that could perhaps be a loss of function. Yet we know in the right hemisphere, the capacity for memory is phenomenal. Again, it's called, I think, eidetic memory. Now, if that was more accessible, or in fact both hemispheres had that capacity archaically, and putting aside any other forms of communication we had, we're just talking about memory and information here, it's not surprising that, for example, the oral traditions worked so phenomenally well. If you couldn't forget anything, you wouldn't need to write it down. You wouldn't need any form of abstract information storage, particularly how limited it is. I mean, you know, I guess I'd certainly include myself in this. Most of us perhaps struggle to relate to forms of poetry, but if you ever engage with poetry in an altered state, or it takes you to an altered state, you almost have to be in an altered state to really appreciate it. And then you sort of get a sense of what the person was actually experiencing, which is way, way more information than just the abstract words and sentences we use to portray information or to convey information now. So basically what I'm saying is, yes, it could be a symptom of degeneration that we've had to rely on abstract forms of information exchange. We may have had phenomenal memory, and people still have that today. And again, it's almost always, well, it's pretty much always right hemisphere. In fact, I've never come across a case yet, somebody will perhaps correct me in time, where damage to the right hemisphere has released phenomenal abilities in the left. Never happened as far as I'm aware. Now, there's not always clear evidence, but wherever there is evidence, it's always the other way on. More damage to the left hemisphere, paradoxically, can release phenomenal ability in the right. I mean, what on earth's going on there? What's that all about? You know, so lots and lots of clues, and you know, we could cover many more. I know we're limited for time, but I'd certainly, you know, my real point here is about getting a diagnosis. We need a clear diagnosis as to what's going on, and my agenda at the minute is, can I create reasonable doubt regarding the functionality of our neural system? If our neural system's fine and our crazy behavior's down to something else, okay, that's absolutely fine. But surely when you look at our collective behavior, the very fact we have these ancient traditions telling us we've gone stark raving mad, and history's littered with incredibly insightful people saying exactly that, and they were being quite serious. It wasn't the kind of jokey, oh, we're a bit crazy. It's like, no, humans are seriously insane. The very fact those things exist, we should be very alarmed. You know, that shouldn't exist if we're neurologically functional. So surely it must be worth discounting this. We should take a long, hard look at all these factors and totally dismiss the remotest possibility that there's a glitch in our neural system. Because if there is a glitch in our neural system, we're going to be chasing our tails forever while we disappear effectively up our own arsehole. And it looks like that's what we're doing. You know, we wage war on each other. We've killed 100 million of our own kind in the last 100 years. We're decimating our environment. We know, you know, it's very fragile. These are all symptoms of something seriously amiss. And if you have a patient coming to some eminent consultant, one of the things they're going to want to discount is structural damage, is a problem with the structure. That's always something that's looked at. We've never looked at that. Modern science has never seriously considered the possibility our neural system isn't functional. And that's just bad science, because that's the only piece of equipment we have. We've never checked it. We've never calibrated it. We should at least check it and see if it's fine. And I think there's more than enough evidence. There's a massive amount of evidence to suggest otherwise. The paradox is, of course, we're using the very same piece of equipment to address these questions and to come up with answers. And particularly when the standard evidence or the standard data from neurological and psychological research suggests, well, it's more than suggests, states very clearly that we continually lie to ourselves. We're in a state of perpetual delusion. All the things the ancient traditions talked about, that's enough for me. It's like, okay, emergency stop. Let's check this out. Of course, that would be a sane reaction. If we're, as a species, not sane, we'll just keep wandering along off the precipice. That's what seems to be going on.
Well, in terms of reading, writing, and speech, I've read a lot when I've been reading about ancient myths and tales of lost civilizations and all that sort of stuff that directly or indirectly suggested that at some point in a distant past, societies were a lot less noisy, a lot less busy. People were doing less, but also they were saying less. There just wasn't this frantic daily state of affairs that we live with today, and that's something that we actually take as a side product of advancement. Because it has increased. You look back at ancient Egypt, for example, we consider that they did a lot, but not as much as us. They wrote a lot, but not as much as us. So we see all this activity as, to greater or lesser extent, as a sign of advancement. But I think it's possibly the contrary is true.
Absolutely agree. Completely back to front, and again, certainly something that shouldn't be difficult to look at. Really, I mean, one thing that struck me quite some while ago, and I bring it up a lot, is if we are sane, if we are neurologically functional, we should welcome the idea of a health check. We should really be scrutinizing this equipment to see if there is a problem, and any resistance to that is a symptom itself. But yes, back to your point. I mean, this is exactly what I'd expect. In fact, our very concepts. And concepts are left brain. The left brain doesn't perceive reality directly, so it has to invent abstract concepts, which is seen, again, as advanced, but maybe it's not. But getting back to the point, it may be, or in fact it would be, if there's a serious and progressive problem with our neural system, our very ideas of who and what we are, very beingness, would be badly distorted. And it certainly opens up the possibility that what we see as some kind of progression is in fact exactly the opposite, some kind of degeneration. It's not that we still don't have glimpses of wonderful genius, although that's all they are. I mean, as a species, you chat to people day to day, we often take credit as a species for a tiny minority of people's rare insights, often coming out of altered states, that are then hijacked and manufactured by society at large. More and more symptoms, I think, of as a species, we're collectively becoming less able, more stupid, more frenetic in our activity, running round and round in circles, stressed all the time, and achieving what exactly? I mean, most of our technology is engineered to build machines to kill humans. The stealth bombers and missile systems and whatever. The very best of our technology is about defense contracts. And most of us spend our lives, certainly in the Western world, running around in circles, stressed out our minds, not remotely experiencing anything other than, anticipation about the next piece of kit we're going to buy. We get it, and then it doesn't satisfy us. Lots of people have written on this, of course. It's nothing new in this. But yes, I mean, if there's a serious and progressive problem, that's exactly what I'd expect to see. And many people have commented on this, that our very ideas of what our purpose is, for want of a better word. You speak to somebody who's had what might be called a relatively profound experience, or you'll find examples of people who've been locked into this crazy frenetic activity, and occasionally it happens spontaneously or sometimes through these kind of approaches or treatments. People then end up typically stepping back and just going, what on earth is the point of this? And walking away from it, because the experience that we can have, it's certainly wired in us somewhere, makes this look as ludicrous as it really is. You wouldn't swap a minute of that experience for a whole lifetime of this madness. That's the kind of typical response. Now, the very fact people have those experiences and still have them today to some extent, again, if we were a sane species, we'd be stopping everything and trying to figure out what the hell's going on here, and why is it possible that we could find phenomenal contentment in a different state of being? Why we're so obsessed with maintaining the status quo? If our left hemisphere is perceptually dominant and it's highly specialized and it was providing us with some wonderful experience, well, okay, I'd be on a pretty thin ice here. But our current neural configuration is clearly creating massive stress and massive inhumanity, and we're hell-bent on destroying ourselves. So yeah, I think we have it completely back to front, and yet there are examples, there are people who still have experiences, and they will tell you in the best language they possibly can that, as historically has gone on forever, that there's something that makes the very best of what we think we're doing utterly absurd. And it's not just one or two people. It crosses cultural boundaries. It crosses religious boundaries. It's historically there. Time and time again, people have experiences, and then they just say, "No, this is insane." There's another way of perceiving the world, perceiving reality, perceiving ourselves that make this the insane and very, very sick joke that it is.
I was reading an article just today, actually, called "The Psychology of Death," and the author was talking about people who'd had near-death experiences or had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and how there's two ways that they dealt with these experiences, but the most common one was to sort of, as you say, stand back in what they had been doing. Not all of them had been leading the sort of lives that we describe, the modern Western industrialized style, but those that had, they stepped back and just went, whoa, what have I been doing with my life?
Yep.
Exactly along the lines that you say. But in terms of your idea about altered states and creativity and what have you, I mean, since the days of Think and Grow Rich, the book, every so-called self-help manual worth its name has emphasized going somewhere else for inspiration, allowing your brain, your mind to be still so that it can function in a different way. And that's presented sometimes in quite esoteric terms. Other times, particularly in Think and Grow Rich, it's very, very practical. And it just details all of these people with, industrialists and inventors, people who are responsible for some of the great innovations of the modern age. They all did the same thing. Frantic activity and thinking, didn't get them where they got. It was allowing access to a different state of mind.
Yep. Well, again, that these patterns, whichever piece of this jigsaw we're talking about, these patterns are very consistent. And again, completely agree, and I allude to that in the book and elsewhere, that our real genius, our real phenomenal abilities, by definition, they're not part of the current executive left hemisphere. If they were, we'd all experience them all the time. We don't. They're considered anomalous. So if they're not part of our normal wiring, they must be part of some generally inaccessible wiring, and yet we still do access it from time to time. And as I said earlier, there are techniques that can enhance that possibility. Anything from meditation, yoga, the kind of Trappist tradition, trying to quieten the chattering voice, which we know is left hemisphere related, through to more what might be considered more radical approaches. And even, why do we even need techniques, practices, and approaches? Why doesn't it just work? Why doesn't, the wiring that clearly must be there somewhere that allows us these phenomenal abilities and so on, why doesn't it just work? Why do we need to do anything at all to get it to work? Well, again, there may be other possibilities, but it kind of makes sense that if we've, through no fault of our own, we've ended up with a neurological condition, quite a severe one, then you start looking at, well, actually, were these treatments, were these attempts to try and access something that we should all have and we've lost? Of course, it starts to make sense then when you look at it from this different perspective. And I think when you find individuals who've been right in the thick of the cutting edge of Western culture and what we're all supposed to aspire to, I'm not saying everybody does, of course, not everybody buys into this madness. When people like that are prepared to effectively to walk away, that should tell us that, no, there's something much better on offer. And all these traditions say that. They say we're living in a perpetual state of delusion. And I find it absolutely fascinating, well, and shocking as well, that in the modern Western literature, you have all these ancient traditions saying we were sliding into delusion. In the modern Western literature, the left hemisphere appears to be in a perpetual state of delusion. Now, is that some kind of weird coincidence? I don't think so, and yet the right hemisphere appears to have the capacity to connect with reality. And when we get those glimpses, and depending on what approaches we've used or what spontaneously happens, the reality we perceive through the right hemisphere, aside from anything else, seems to correlate more closely with our objective data, whether it's from physics or from ecology and so on. The way we currently perceive the world is somehow fragmented and we're separate from each other. All our data is telling us that's a lie. And yet in these more deeply altered states, the way people try and describe these experiences, and of course we're often trapped with our left hemisphere trying to describe experiences it didn't have. It just thinks it had them when it was out of the way, when we're in an altered state or lucid dreaming or whatever. But the way they're described are much more interconnected and much richer, and there's not this, there's not these separate entities walking about. There's these whole fields of energetic phenomena that the physics tells us are there. So it's not some crazy esoteric new age stuff, and yet our perceptual equipment normally doesn't pick up on this. So, a lot of clues, so many different ways you look at this. And really, I don't think I'm saying anything new at all. I think our ancestors clocked this as they would. I think before this condition really progressed, by definition, they must have been in better shape. Well, the theory is basically wrong. And they were trying to warn us while they were in better shape. And they came up with ingenious approaches to slow the condition, to try and access it. And yet ultimately the condition was so insidious, we've ended up where we are now, to the point where now we're so deluded we actually think we're advancing. Well, that's what you'd get if we had a form of dementia that was progressive, and we've gone past the point, or a lot of us have gone past the point of even knowing subjectively that there's anything wrong. I mean, we kind of look out and see the symptoms and we blame everybody else, and we know there's some serious problems going on. But we find it challenging to look in the mirror and go, oh, yeah, this is where the problem is, despite the fact most of us, and I certainly include myself in this, most of our waking hours are filled with chattering craziness in our head that we wouldn't like to share with anybody else. Now, that's a classic symptom of mental ill health. Now, how many people listening to this or whatever can put their hands up and say, no, I don't have any of that going on? I haven't found many at all. There's a lot of clues here that we're in really deep trouble, and it's mental ill health. The challenge is, I think, recognizing it, being willing to own up to it, and then start to do something about it.
I think it's interesting that altered states of consciousness induced by hallucinogens, for example, quite often change people's lives in terms of, they say that they saw a wider reality, an interconnected reality. And it's even more interesting that, having read a bit about ayahuasca and that experience, that shaman in South America and some people who have gone there to take ayahuasca have reported things like not only having their entire worldview and view of reality altered, but the plants were talking to them and telling them, this was the case, that it wasn't how they thought it was.
Well, again, it starts to sound a bit like a panacea, and it's paradoxically, it either will be or it won't be. But if our origins were born out of an incredibly deep and very unique symbiotic relationship with plants, if effectively the emergence and particularly the expansion of our neocortex was more to do with plant-animal hybrid, and remember, plant and animal are arbitrary terms anyway, it's part of this same big organism really, but sticking with the labels, the concepts that we've come up with, if that really was the case, and the evidence is good for that, and in this kind of post-symbiotic separation, we've lost a lot of the structure that facilitates, our very senses, our ability to perceive things. If that's kind of gone from one of our hemispheres, and again, this is not about blame, it just doesn't have the capacity anymore. If then by using certain approaches, including efforts to ameliorate what by definition must be a chronic neurochemical deficiency, so you start putting back some of these things, or at least crude but powerful analogs, then of course when that piece of equipment starts to light up at least a bit, then of course it's going to be radically different, and our sense of self is by definition is going to be radically different, but our senses and our sense of connection and our all sorts of abilities are going to be different. So it doesn't surprise me at all that people report all this stuff. Of course, we use the term altered states. Well, if the symbiotic model is correct, then currently at this very moment, our normal reference points are the altered state. They're heavily altered states, and they're altered states based on masses of missing biochemistry. And I know people have alluded to this before in a kind of classic hippie way, or done some psychedelics, but basically the evolutionary context supports this massively. That if our neural system, as I said earlier, was designed, constructed, and ran on the biochemistry of the tropical forests, and in fact symbiotic organism by definition, we weren't humans and there weren't trees. There was a symbiotic organism. At least our neocortex was the closest to a symbiotic organism. Then it's not surprising we have a phenomenal relationship with plants. It's not surprising we have the relics of this deep connection. And when we gain this access, we suddenly view plants and the world around us with a profound sense of connection. It's again, it obviously it's going to sound a little bit fluffy, but really, when you look at it like that, the trees, particularly the tropical forest trees, but the trees generally, they're our parents. They grew our neural system, particularly the neocortex, and they were part of they're part of who we are. There wasn't any separation. We might have been physically separate, but the chemistry was a singular organism. There was a constant flow and immersion in the combined biochemistry of 50, 100, several hundred trees, particularly over evolutionary timescales. And that's what our neocortex was built from. That's what it ran on. And without that, it just cannot work. So yeah, when we get these glimpses, it's not surprising. I mean, again, these ancient traditions and the shamanic tradition, they talk about the plants telling us to figure this stuff out. Well, really, it's not the plants telling us. It's us telling us when we make that reconnection. It's like connecting with a long-lost twin who knows an awful lot more, or we've forgotten. They remember and they tell us. Now, it sounds kind of crazy, but if you step back and look at the pieces bit by bit, it's like, well, actually, they could all fit. Did they fit like that? Well, that's what I hope to find out. But certainly the pieces are there. And again, when you factor in this concept, and some people have challenged what I'm doing, saying, well, there's no way to prove this. You're kind of saying, well, we can't possibly see this. Well, I'm saying, yeah, if the equipment we're using is compromised and it's got problems with delusion and loss of sensory awareness, it doesn't mean we can't check this out. We've just got to be very careful with self-assessment. We've got to be careful trusting our rational mind if it's dysfunctional. But we should be able to look at the relatively objective data, and it should tell us something. And there should be a mountain of it. What I'm basically proposing is serious neural retardation resulting in severe perceptual limitation. Okay? Now, that's a pretty major claim. There's no way I'm going to get very far with that unless there's a mountain of evidence. Whether we can perceive it, unless we start to, we've got to be willing, I guess in the tradition of debate, and this should be a safe thing to do. And if we're neurologically functional, there should be no fear in this. Take this on board. Accept the possibility that our neural system's badly compromised. One side much more so than the other, and that's the side that's in charge. Would the world make sense if that's what's going on? And it should be a no-brainer to dismiss. It should be quite easy to look at all this literature and go, absolutely not. There's no connection here. There's no data here. There's no mechanisms. Well, lo and behold, the data's there. The mechanisms are there. It's not absolute proof, but it's bizarre that it's there at all. And I mean, another thing I'm throwing into the mix more and more, I've been working on this for about 20 years. And like I said, at best, it's really just a translation of an ancient idea. I'm finding it interesting, the spectrum of response I'm getting. I'm not just getting supportive comments from people who are, just a bit discontent with modern society, or perhaps have done too many drugs. I'm getting a spectrum of support from across society, including pretty orthodox thinkers, skeptical thinkers, people from the academic disciplines. Are going, oh my God, all these pieces are here. Now that shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be possible for me to make these very powerful claims if society and if humanity is generally neurologically functional. The only people that I'm going to get support of are people who've had some damage to the brain during childhood or whatever. I shouldn't be getting this off people who, by our general thinking, are fully functional and highly intelligent. What's going on here? It's a bit like the emperor's new clothes. There shouldn't be any support for this. But once a few people start saying, oh, actually, this looks like it's got possibilities, suddenly a lot of people are saying, oh my God, this makes sense. There shouldn't be any of that going on. I should be laughed out of town.
I think that beyond psychedelic experiences, the experience of indigenous peoples have a lot to speak to this. And I think the fact that this degeneration is ongoing is evident in the treatment of indigenous people over the last few centuries. And I think that they point to, in some of those indigenous societies, we see more remnants, more than we see in our own societies anyway, of how things were in the past.
Yes, I think there's elements of that. I mean, to be absolutely clear, I think this is a species-wide thing. Nobody's escaped from this. We've all got it, including all the indigenous peoples and tribes as we see them from Western perspective. However, I think there's another insidious layer to this, that as our rational mind, as our left brain became more primitive and began to take control, it tends to work in the way primitive brains do on programming conditioning. And as we were sliding into this neurological problem, nevertheless we could maintain structures and tribal societies and all the care that can often go with that, although not exclusively, because even though our left brain was beginning to take control, it was programmed with what was around it. So if you're effectively brought up in the relics of what we might call a more right brain, or I'd really like to call a more functional brain, because remember, this isn't really about left-right brain. I think a whole neural system had all these phenomenal functions. It's just one side's failed more quickly than the other. But it will kind of go along with that. Those are the programs it will learn. You can train it a bit like you can train a dog. And that's fine if those traditions are relatively uninterrupted. However, if for whatever reason they get interrupted, and it could be environmental catastrophe or whatever, where people have ended up with more fear and coming up with more repressive or more hierarchical systems, which the left brain particularly does. It's quite a primitive formula, sort of survival of the strongest in these hierarchical social structures. Once you get that emerging anywhere, then you've got a problem, because as the left brain begins to kind of create more what we call rational hierarchical structures, it kind of facilitates further demise. So, for example, in using more modern kind of look at things, if you take your young and train them to become more left brain even earlier than they would have done, so you put them in rational schooling systems and fill their heads full of rational stuff and encourage them to do rational things, you're accelerating that thing. The damage is already there, but you're accelerating the shift in dominance to be more left hemisphere than it might have otherwise been. And then when you come into contact with the relics of these tribal systems that have managed to maintain something different, well, you know what's going to happen. You know, fear wins out. Unfortunately, the left hemisphere is a control freak. It wants to impose its believed advancement on the relics of these things it just doesn't understand. And that's what we've seen time and time again. I mean, really, in the wider picture, you know, it's really, overall, it's self-harm species-wide. You know, we're harming ourselves when we do this. But yes, that seems to be the general outcome. But the reverse of that is equally true. You know, I'm particularly interested in a diagnosis that can result in beginning to repair this problem. And again, I think there's a lot of information. We already know a lot about how to do that. But in the meantime, it's certainly possible to train our rational mind to behave in much better ways without necessarily even fixing this problem just yet. So if you bring people up in an environment that encourages things that we might consider more indigenous or tribal, not that they've got the answers to everything, and some tribal cultures are quite aggressive as well, but let's say the best of that, or the kind of things that come out of the spiritual traditions, then it's something you can train, because currently we're training the left brain to be more and more left brain. That's what we're doing, and of course that's exactly what's happening. We could choose to do the opposite and train it to be more open to approaches that, you know, engage the right hemisphere without fear. Currently, we legislate against that. You know, we've ended up in a situation where the very things that could be helping us, because it frightens the rational mind so much, we've prohibited and legislated against the very things that keep the doors open, that allow us a little bit of access to feeling more connected, to feeling more empathy, to not feeling so aggressive. So we can reverse that immediately if we want to. We could choose to do that today or tomorrow. So, okay, let's dump this insanity. Yes, there's a problem here. It might take a little while to figure out all the answers, but in the meantime, we know an awful lot about certainly what not to do, and to some degree what to do. But of course, that's a hard sell when the most influential members of society are the most damaged, and they think more of the same is going to somehow end up in a different place. Of course it's not. It's going to end up in a very, very bad place. But we could make choices today. Unfortunately, if, as I say, if the people who make the decisions are some of the least functional members of society, that isn't going to happen until we fully recognize that there's a neurological condition here. So yes, I think ultimately there's a pattern here that as the left hemisphere assumes control, it slowly begins to create the world in its own image, and not only that, accelerate its own rise to dominance. So as I say, filling the heads of children full of abstract concepts, getting them into that phase as early as possible, when in indigenous cultures you at least see some examples of where that's delayed as long as possible, or children are invited into the kind of shamanic tradition, of course very safely and very carefully, and trying to keep the door open to something a little bit more sane. And then you get a clash of cultures, and of course the aggression and fear tends to win out. So yes, I agree, that's exactly what's happened.
Well, as we bring things to a close today, Tony, I'd just like to offer a thought from my perspective, which is what I see in the world is accelerating left brain degeneration and domination that's manifesting itself in the growing problems that we see right across the world in virtually every area. But I also sense, and this is partly why we're having this conversation, I also sense I don't want to use the word fight back, it's the wrong term, but I sense a growing reemergence of the right brain. And this may be some sort of survival mechanism, a sort of a last-ditch, an emergency response to try and avoid species destruction, ultimately. So I don't know what your thought is on that.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of talk of different perspectives and re-emergence of this, that, and the other. I'm a little bit more skeptical of some ends of that. I certainly think that some of the kind of technological things that have probably, again, come out of the few geniuses that are around, but they've created a communication system and an awareness system that we all have much more access to information than we did in relatively recent times. At least that's how it seems. And in addition to that, I think what I tend to see in recorded history, and of course recorded history is probably quite distorted and not complete, but nevertheless, you tend to get these patterns of increasing control, increasing tyranny, to the point that it creates its own demise. You get greater and greater inequality, the classic rise and fall of empires. And I think we're in a phase now where, although there's nothing new in that, Western culture, and these things seem to be happening more and more quickly, more and more people are aware of the incredible inequality and the fact that, our lives are built upon layer of exploitation. The fact we can have this conversation is based on equipment that relies on somewhere kids down mines and massive inhumanity. Now we're more and more aware of that, and more people are, even rational. It's not like we can't conceive. I mean, part of my interest is how to build a diagnosis the left hemisphere can understand. Well, currently, because the left hemisphere is in charge, it's almost got to figure out that it's the problem. And we can certainly come up with concepts. We can certainly look at information and go, look, there's a serious problem here. And I think that's partly what's going on. There's more awareness, and we're beginning to realize, even in basic conceptual fashion, that this is unsustainable, there's a serious problem. And some of the decisions, or a lot of the decisions, a percentage of people are making are increasingly insane. And that's... Once people start flagging that up and people are willing to look, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really. It's just, perhaps partly we've never really asked these questions before, at least in recent times. So I think it's in part a repeating cycle of ever-increasing tyranny, but it gets so bad that eventually it implodes. It's like the hand grasping tighter on the water, and the harder it squeezes, the more it flies out. And I think that's partly what's going on, and together with greater communication. I'm not necessarily sold on the idea of the right hemisphere itself is somehow re-emerging. I think our awareness is making that possibility much more realistic. And yes, there is this cross-fertilization now. There's more and more people becoming aware of these relic traditions, the shamanistic traditions, and people from Western culture visiting and having these kind of experiences. That's certainly helping. But I think it's just more of a conceptual awareness as well, and a willingness to ask questions. I mean, I'm certainly, my interest in all of this isn't, even if this turns out to be a valid theory, I'm not remotely interested in being the guy that pointed out what went wrong and it's all over. I'm really interested in the possibility as to how quickly we could turn this around. And the idea of a neurological condition, while challenging, although it's in perfect accord with the ancient traditions, just slightly different terminology, it reduces all the symptoms we see from warfare and ecological catastrophe to a human scale condition. There's a problem between our ears, a challenging problem, yes, but it's something we can turn around incredibly quickly, or it's certainly something we can change the worst effects of it very quickly. There's a mountain of information, and all these traditions tell us exactly how we can glimpse something phenomenally better quite quickly. That's within our grasp today. We already know an awful lot about that. The fact there's prohibition around that is another matter. That's a symptom of the insanity. We know how to feel a lot better. We know how to induce states of empathy and compassion. We know all that. That's not a great mystery at all. And beyond that, I'm almost certain we can fix any problem that we've found ourselves subject to. So my objective with this isn't to create, or isn't to present a hopeless diagnosis. It's really to say, well, actually, yes, it's challenging, but this is human scale. We know a huge amount how to change at least elements of this very quickly, and a complete fix is probably well within our grasp. But we need to recognize what the problem is. That's the real challenge, I think.
Excellent. Well, in closing, Tony, perhaps you could just tell listeners about the book, which is coming out in the summer. Just to remind us once again, the title is Return to the Brain of Eden. And also, I don't know if you've got any websites or anything like that you'd like to share.
Yes. Well, I've self-published a sort of, an outline of the theory for the last few years. It's the book's called Left in the Dark. The limits of self-publishing and distribution and all the rest of it. It led me to sign up with a publisher. So that's being republished in May or June under the title of Return to the Brain of Eden. So yes, that's coming out in a few months. In the meantime, there's quite a lot more information. If you look up Left in the Dark, there's a website, and there's links on there to a sister website with also a lot more information called Beyond Belief. So yes, look out for those two websites. A lot of links on there, and links to YouTube material and so on. And initially, what we've been talking about sounds like a great big sort of complicated theory. The information around it, there is a lot of context, but in its essence, it's as simple as this. One side of our brain's more damaged than the other, and it's in charge. And, we can choose to stay with that, or we can fix it. End of.
Wonderful. Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks very much.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's LegalizeFreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffitt, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.